your material so that the pattern is facing the direction you want on both sides, and then you're just going to grab your bodice pattern and lay that down so that the center is on the fold. Then you can go ahead and pin it down and cut it out. I'm giving myself a lot of extra seam allowance just because that's what I prefer. You can buy a pattern, or you can do like I did in my previous sewing video as well as this sewing video and make your own using a piece of clothing that you already own and like the fit of, and just tracing it out. After I finish this front piece, I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same process for the back piece of the bodice. Remember that the neckline is the only thing that's going to be different. The neckline on the back should be higher than the neckline for the front. And then I'm also going to snip the center part in half so that my bodice in the back is in two pieces. And then I'm actually going to put it together, right sides in, pin it, and sew it. Make sure that you sew 1 centimeter away from the edge. This seems unnecessary, but it is necessary for adding the zipper later on. For the bib top thing, I'm grabbing white material and I am cutting it out almost in the same way that I did for the bodice pattern originally, except I'm stopping partway down the shoulder line and bringing it down in a straight line, however long or short you want it to be. Remember to add at least 1 centimeter seam allowance. You don't want it to perfectly line up with the neckline of this. You want it to go over a little bit because you're going to need to hem it later. Then I'm going to set that aside and move on to adding some darts just to make sure that this dress is nice and fitted.
No. Blimey, Harry, didn't you ever wonder where your mom and dad learned it all?
And once those are pinned down, just go ahead and sew them.
You're a wizard, Harry.
Once our darts are sewn in, we can go ahead and attach our bib top thing. And again, make sure that the neckline doesn't line up perfectly. You want it to be 1 centimeter longer all the way around so that you can hem it properly later. And then I'm just going to go ahead and pin that down. And once I have that pinned down, I am also going to go around and pin down the ruffle material around the edge. And once that is all pinned down, you're just going to go ahead and sew around the outer edge where the lace is. Next up, I'm going to attempt to hem the neckline. I'm actually pretty sure I'm not doing this right, but this is the only way that I could come up with. I'm just snipping a little bit of that excess material diagonally towards the corners of the bodice, and then I am folding it over and pinning it down, and then I'm just going to go ahead and sew around the edge and sew those pinned pieces down. This is the only way I could figure out how to hem this top, but I'm sure there's actually a proper way to do it. I feel like the way I did it works out fine for now, but it'll probably end up fraying eventually, so. Once that's all done, I'm going to go ahead and attach my back and front bodice pieces together, and I'm doing that by laying them down on top of each other with the right sides facing in, and then I'm just going to pin across the top part of the shoulder. Once I have those pieces pinned, I'm just going to go ahead and sew it. Next up, I am making the ties for my dress, so I'm grabbing my white material and I'm cutting 2 pieces out. These can be as long or short or wide or thin as you want them to be. I'm making mine really long because I want them to wrap before they tie. Then I'm going to fold that in half long ways and pin and sew one side of the material closed. And I'm also going to pin and sew one of the short ends closed, but only one. With the other side, you're going to want to flip the entire thing right side out and then iron it flat. So then going back to our bodice, we're just going to want to turn it inside out, and then we're going to attach our ties. So to do this, I'm just going to grab my tie material and I am going to sandwich it in the middle of the front and the back bodice. Line it up depending on how low or high you want your ties to sit on your waist, and then just make sure that the edge of your tie lines up with the edge of the bodice material, and then the rest of your tie material should go inside of the shirt, not on the outside. So then I'm just going to pin that closed, and then I'm just going to sew that line right over that tie. And when you flip it right side out, it should look something like this, and now we can move on to the skirt. So since I am using a patterned material, I have to cut out all 4 pieces of the skirt separately and then sew them together so that the pattern is facing the correct way all the way around. So I'm just laying out my material the direction that I want the pattern to face, and then I'm just going to go ahead and grab my skirt pattern and lay it down, pin it, and cut it out with seam allowance. Just make sure that the pattern is lined up the way that you want it to lay while you're wearing it, and make sure that it's that same way for all 4 pieces. You're going to want to do this and cut out 4 separate pieces. So once you have all 4 of your pieces cut out, we're just going to go ahead and start attaching them together. You're going to do this by grabbing one piece, laying it with the right side up, and grabbing a second one and laying it with the right side facing down. And then you're just going to pin one of the edges closed. Then you're just going to want to open it up, lay another piece with the right side facing down on top of it, and pin that edge closed, and then keep repeating that until all of the pieces are connected into one flowy skirt. And then once all the sides are pinned, you can go ahead and sew them. So once it's all sewn up, it should look something like this. And now I'm just going to go ahead and start adding the ruffles to the bottom of my skirt. So I'm just taking that same ruffle material that we used on the top, and I'm just pinning that all the way around the edge of my skirt. And then of course, once it's all pinned down, I'm just going to sew it. And once our ruffle hem is all attached, we are just going to go ahead and connect the top bodice to the bottom skirt. And I'm going to do that by flipping my skirt inside out and keeping my bodice right side out, and then I'm just going to sandwich the bodice in between the skirt so that the waistlines of both match up. Hopefully that makes sense, or you can just tell by watching what I'm doing, but I'm just going to line up the waistlines of both of those and then pin them together. One really important thing to note is that you want the back seam of the shirt that we sewed to line up with one of the seams of the skirt. This is super necessary for adding the zipper a little bit later on. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin that down all the way across. You can pin it so that the edges line up evenly, but I actually just wanted my waistline to sit higher, so that's why I'm not pinning it evenly. But just pin that all the way across, making sure that the back seam of the bodice lines up with the seam of the skirt, and then you can just go ahead and sew them together, which should end up looking something like this. And now we can move on to adding our zipper. So I'm going to the back seam of the bodice and the back seam of the skirt, and I am just opening that excess material and ironing it flat. It's kind of hard to explain, but you can pretty much just see what I mean and what I'm doing. And once I have that ironed open, I'm just going to go ahead and start lining up my zipper. And now we are going to start pinning it down. This is a little tricky, but basically you want the center of your zipper to line up with the center seam that you sewed. So just be really careful, pay a lot of attention, and try and get these center parts to line up as nicely as you can. And also, this is really difficult to explain, so I don't know if it's going to make any sense, but when I sewed the top bodice to my skirt and I was sewing around the edge, I made sure to skip over the back seam of the skirt and the top. So basically I sewed all the way up until that part, and then I just jumped over it and then continued sewing. And then I cut away that excess material from where the zipper will be. And I just did this because it'll make it a lot easier when we rip that seam open. You won't have that side stitch blocking the way. Hopefully that made sense, and now I'm going to go ahead and start sewing my zipper. So you'll notice that the zipper tab is going to be blocking the way of your needle. So you're going to want to start sewing the zipper from a few inches down from the top, and then you're just going to sew all the way down around the perimeter and back up to a few inches from the top on the other side. And then you are going to go ahead and rip open that seam. So I'm just grabbing a seam ripper and I'm ripping the seam open. So once you rip open that seam and the zippered track is exposed, you can go ahead and unzip your zipper. And then once your zipper tab is out of the way, you can go back up to the top and sew the edges of those pieces that you missed before down. So once your zipper is attached, it should look something like this. And once that's all done, it's time to move on to the sleeves. So you can buy a sleeve pattern, copy one from online, or you can just kind of draw out this funky little shape like I did. It's pretty simple. And then you can go ahead and pin that down to your material and cut it out. That is what the sleeve shape should look like, and it'll make a puffy cuffed sleeve. I'm not paying attention to what direction the pattern is facing for the sleeves because, quite frankly, I just don't care. So then I'm just going to go ahead and cut out 2 pieces for my sleeves. And I'm also going to cut out a long rectangle of white material for the cuff of my sleeve, but we'll get to that more later. Right now I'm just going to fold that sleeve material in half with the right sides facing in, and then I'm just going to sew that little edge closed. This is going to be our armpit seam. So now comes the tricky part, which is attaching the sleeve to the top. So I'm just grabbing my dress and I'm flipping it inside out. I'm leaving my sleeve right side out, and I'm just going to go ahead and stuff that through the armhole of the dress. You want the weird shaped wonky side of that sleeve to line up with the armhole of the bodice, and you want the armpit seam of the sleeve to line up with the armpit seam of the bodice. And then the first thing that you're going to do is go ahead and line up the armpit seams and then pin that in place. And then I'm also going to line up the edges and pin a little bit up on either side of the armpit seam. I'm leaving the top part of the sleeve unpinned because I'm going to ruffle it before we pin it down. So then you're just going to want to grab a needle and thread, and you're going to want to do a ruffle stitch all the way around the top half of the sleeve. And then once that is all ruffled, you can go ahead and pin down the rest of the sleeve to the bodice. And as always, once it's all pinned, you can go ahead and sew it.
You're a wizard, Harry.
Expecto Patronum!
So once our sleeve is attached to our dress, we are going to go ahead and move on to finishing off the cuff. So I am once again taking a needle and thread, and I am ruffling the top half of the sleeve. You don't need to ruffle the bottom half. That's going to sit under your armpit because that would just be uncomfortable. So I am ruffling the top half, and then I'm going to go ahead and make the cuffs. So I'm grabbing my white material and I am folding it once up to the center and then folding it twice, and then I'm just sewing that open edge closed and ironing it flat. And then what you should do is measure it around your arm and then sew it into a cuffed circle the size that you want it to be around your arm. I did not do this, but I just made my life harder, so you should do that. Then all you need to do is turn your sleeve inside out, place the cuff on the inside, and pin and sew around the edges. As you can see, If I had just sewed it into a circle in the first place, this would have been a lot easier, but I didn't, so this took me an unnecessary amount of time. But once you have that all pinned down, you can go ahead and sew it, and once you have that all sewed up, it is done and the dress is finally complete.